Good afternoon. Welcome, I guess, to the new year, which is what we're really facing. This is one of our first events after some time in the Berkeley Center. Delighted to see you here. Welcome to the Berkeley Center. For those of you who don't know it, it's four plus years old. Pulls together different parts of Georgetown University that work on issues of religion, peace, and world affairs. And I'm Catherine Marshall, and I'm responsible for the religion and global development programs that are part of the Berkeley Center. I'm delighted to introduce Carole Rakodi. She is in Washington for a variety of other events and agreed to come here to describe what is really a quite unprecedented and quite extraordinary program that the British Development Agency has supported to try to fill the very large knowledge gaps that relate to the roles of religion in international development. So Carole will tell you all about that. I've been part of it actually even probably before she was, in the sense that I was talking to DIFD in the very early years because I had been working in the World Bank on the same kinds of issues of exploring why should we care about religion? What is it we should know? Why is it relevant? What are the intellectual as well as the practical obstacles to having more of a dialogue and a conversation? Very briefly, Carole, whose CV or whose bio you've seen, has been the director of this program since 2002. As she has just told me, she's really going back to her prior life now. She is a geographer and has been working on urbanization, both as an academic and as a consultant, as a practitioner, I think we call them. And she's done very substantial research, especially in Africa. But for the past 5+ years, she has managed a consortium that has involved the University of Birmingham, University of Bath, Islamic Relief, and several other groups working in several countries, really doing path-breaking research to try to understand much better what's happening and what the issues are. So I'm delighted to welcome Carole here at this sort of finale, sadly, of the DIFD program, and to hear from her what are the major conclusions. After Carole speaks, what I would suggest we do is, because it's a small group, we can go round quickly and you can tell us all who you are. Since she's poised, ready to click, I will not suggest that she do that now, and then we will obviously open it up to a conversation.
Thank you, Catherine. It's very nice to be here, and it seems very formal in this fairly small group to stand up here, but what it enables me to do is to manipulate the PowerPoint while still looking at you rather than having to turn my back to you. So at least while I'm doing this part, I'll stand up here. As Catherine said, what I've been doing is coordinating a research program which has been working with partner organizations in what we call our focus countries, 4 focus countries, 2 in South Asia, 2 in Africa, largely because those are the main areas in which the British Aid Programme works. With the International Institute, with the Indian Institute for Dalit Studies, the Nigerian Institute for Social and Economic Research in Ibadan, the Lahore University of Management Sciences, and the University of Dar es Salaam. The program is made up of 11 research projects, and although it is what I would call a social science research program, and therefore has a great deal of freedom to do basic social science research aimed at understanding the world, it also has needed to do work that is policy relevant, but not immediately policy operational. So I would draw a distinction between the sort of research we've been doing and the sort of research that a consultant might do, which produces immediately operational recommendations. having said that, we are supposed to interact as academics with the potential users of the research, and particularly with the non-academic users of the research. And so research communication has been important throughout the programme. What I'll do in this presentation, because clearly I can't present the detailed results of 5 years of research, is to present some key findings from some aspects of the work that we've been doing, and to just list very quickly some of the other research questions that we've been looking at, and to raise some of the issues that arise when trying to do this, some of the conceptual and methodological issues that arise when trying to research in this quite neglected and tricky area. And what I probably won't have time to do, I think, is to talk about future research questions. We see the programme in terms of two overarching themes. The first theme is looking essentially at the individual level. So it's looking at religious values and beliefs as they are held by individuals, and the ways in which those influence the attitudes, the values, the actions of individuals and their interactions with the social groups to which they belong, from their families upwards. So what we're looking at is lived religion. And I won't read out this quotation because you can see it, but this quotation captures to me the way, in our starting point, the way we're looking at it, essentially as social scientists. So under this heading, the key research question has been to do with the relationship between religious values and beliefs and people's adherence to a particular religious tradition and their values and attitudes. Focused in terms of how religious teachings are interpreted as they are conveyed at the local level. So the religious teachings of the major religious traditions that are relevant in particular contexts, but how are those interpreted at the local level? And in particular, how are they interpreted in relation to some of the issues that are central to the question of development? So issues to do with poverty and wealth and inequality, and issues to do with gender roles and relationships. And how do the givers, if you like, of religious teaching interpret it, and then how do the recipients of religious teaching interpret their religious tradition? And then what role does that play in social constructions of well-being, how people see the good life, and how they see their social relationships? And in particular, another interest of particular relevance to development, how does religion influence people's attitudes towards corruption? How do they understand corruption in governance and in relation to their own behaviour? The second theme, and this is the one that I'll be concentrating on, deals with what I'd call more of a societal level. It's looking at the relationships between religious organisation and social and political organisations at the societal level, from national governments down to civil society movements, social movements. And we have a number of research questions, again, under this heading. The first is, how do relationships between organised religion, religious organisations, and states and societies play out in the political arena? Religion clearly is embedded in very different and very dynamic ways in political and social and economic systems, but it's not well understood how it's embedded by the mainstream development actors. Traditionally, religion and religious actors in the public sphere have been viewed by their critics as obstacles to progressive social change, to inclusive citizenship, and to the achievement of human development objectives. But what political liberalisation has done, amongst many other things, is to open up spaces in which different political actors can start to develop roles. And that has led to both greater political inclusion and more opportunities for political rivalry and conflict. And it's into that religious actors have had more space to insert themselves. They clearly have a long history of political engagement. But this increased political space has enabled them to increase their influence and launch new political initiatives. So the research that was done in the program in our 4 countries of Pakistan, India, Nigeria, and Tanzania, and I'll make some heroic generalizations in what I'm going to say, and I'm very well aware I can be pulled up on some of the generalizations, but it's a question of time. The research teams found that the most striking change in those contexts in the post-colonial period has been a shift from the predominantly secular constitutional settlements which were agreed at independence to political arenas in which religious organizations play active roles. So the return of religion to public life has been marked by electoral mobilization by religious actors, by the co-optation by power holders of religious actors, and by new discourses centered on religious identity. It's also been marked by attempts by some religious groups to dramatically change the prevailing political order. So, for example, the demand by some Sikhs for secession in India. Some of those attacks have been crushed, and the demand for Sikh succession is one. It never went anywhere, that demand. But others continue to threaten the very viability of the state, and I think Pakistan is an obvious case in point. Does this new political space for religious actors actually raise the question of whether religious-based political parties might win political power? I would argue that that's possible, but probably only in the short term in most countries, and certainly in our case study countries. First of all, in some countries, religious-based political parties are not allowed. So Tanzania and Nigeria, they are not allowed. Doesn't mean to say existing parties won't reflect religious interests, but specifically religious parties are not allowed constitutionally. Second, even where they are, democracy may undercut the ability of religious extremists to take over, because in any of the faith traditions, there are both privileged people and disadvantaged people. And secular parties can take advantage of that to seek electoral support. So, for example, in India, the secular political parties seek support from marginalized parts of the religious traditions. Whereas in authoritarian regimes, their need for legitimacy can lead to the co-optation and empowerment of religious actors. And again, Pakistan is a case in point. And that can have adverse implications, both for democracy and for the achievement of development objectives. And thirdly, we can actually look at the record of regimes in which religion is either formally or informally integrated with politics, maybe through the establishment of an Islamic state or control by religious political parties, or permitting religious actors to exercise influence over decision-making. Their record in terms of improving governance and achieving human development objectives seems to be pretty poor. So a case study of the period of, in which the Islamist MMA alliance between religious political parties took over power in northwestern frontier province in Pakistan between 2002 and 2007 found that that integration of theology and religious political parties into government didn't, despite the rhetoric, make very much difference in terms of greater equality and social inclusion, and it definitely worsened the position of women and religious minorities. But even there, it was subject to challenge. Not only are there external challenges, but there were also internal challenges. And it's interesting that that regime was voted out of power after one term in office, because they didn't actually deliver on their rhetoric. And so I would suggest that even if religious political parties do succeed in getting access to power in democratic systems, they are by no means secure in being able to maintain that power. In some countries, deficiencies in the constitution or the electoral system exacerbate conflict. For example, Nigeria, where the privileging of indigeneity over national citizenship exacerbates religious and ethnic conflict at the state and the local levels. But electoral sorry, I skipped a bit too far, but bear with me. There are processes which have been put in place to try and manage this increased religious competition that has been there for a long time but seems to have come to new heights since political liberalisation, fostered by other changes as well. But countries are very aware of the dangers of that, and so there are mechanisms which have been put in place to try and address that. For example, proportionality in or rotation in senior government positions, both political positions and bureaucratic positions. So in both Nigeria and Tanzania, senior political and bureaucratic office, heads of the armed forces and so on, is rotated between different political groups, and broad social agreement has been secured to that sort of arrangement. In addition, in some instances, the increased involvement of religion in the public sphere and the danger that rises of that leads to of potentially more conflict has led to creative responses, such as the setting up of bodies where interfaith dialogue can occur, such as the Nigerian Interreligious Council. At the moment, they're relatively new organisations. Their impact has been limited, but they are quite promising. That's not to say that they are 100% implemented, because they're not. For example, in Nigeria, at the state and the local levels, these processes for managing religious competition don't always work. The role that religion plays in the lives of many of those who are religiously active is clearly very positive. It's a source of empowerment, but religion can be a way in which people are also disadvantaged and discriminated against. It seems to be the case that this is more likely to be addressed where the disadvantaged within religious traditions can use their identity, their religious identity, in order to press for recognition and by the political power holders, by, for example, the secular political parties. For example, disadvantaged groups such as Muslims and Dalits, Sikhs and Hindus in India have used their weight of numbers as an electoral resource, as well as religious resources like converting out of Hinduism to Buddhism, or investing in religious political places to increase their self-confidence, their visibility, their ability to influence. A second piece of research that some of our colleagues have been doing has addressed the question of what roles do religious organisations play in policy making. And I've already mentioned the role of religious political parties, but this is not talking about religious political parties now. It's talking about faith-based organisations and what roles have they played in the arena which has opened up for greater consultation on policy making by poverty reduction strategy processes, the proposals and policy programs that governments have had to draw up in order to access international funding. The research team found that religious organisations in countries such as Nigeria and Tanzania have organisational strength, they have legitimacy, and they have a grassroots membership. But they had been, at the time of the research, had relatively little involvement in the opportunities for policy consultation, because those processes have not provided good opportunities for civil society participation in general, particularly in their first round. Religious organisations also tend to have quite an uneasy relationship with government, and moreover they lack the relevant resources of skills and money and expertise to collect information and to represent information to government, and in particular to represent the views and opinions of the poor communities with which they are in touch. So what the programme did was to mount a pilot project which worked with networks of faith-based organizations in the two countries to assemble data on issues which were central to the poverty reduction strategy programs and their successors, to collect it at the grassroots, to analyse the findings, and to present them to government at appropriate entry points. And that pilot project, in our view, demonstrated that faith-based organisations can collaborate across religious and denominational divides to do this. There wasn't a great deal of evidence that the views they assembled varied very much from the views assembled by civil society organisations, secular organisations doing similar things. And that's not surprising in countries where 80% plus of the population claim to be adherents to either Islam or Christianity. What they do bring is reach to the local level, which many civil society organisations, NGOs, don't. They bring authority, particularly if their history of rather tricky relationships with governments can be overcome. And they have the organisational framework, which means that our very small pilot project involving a handful of organisations could potentially be scaled up to generate a great deal of data which is relevant to government policy. A third, and so we concluded that this sort of pilot project of faith organisations working together could provide a model for greater engagement, greater both critical and positive engagement with government in the policy-making process, and in particular with the potential to represent the views of poor communities. A third element of the research that we looked at was the question of social movements. We started from the assumption that indigenous social movements are far more likely to bring about lasting social change than any sort of interventions by external development actors. So the assumption about religious organisations generally seems to be that they either are a hindrance to progressive social change, they're an obstacle, or they play an active role in achieving it. And we wanted to look at the circumstances in which those might be true, either of those might be true. And in order to do this, we decided that we would focus on the women's movement and the way in which the women's movement engages with religion in attempting to secure legal change to improve the position of women. So the research examined two campaigns in Nigeria, one at the national level to domesticate CEDAW, the Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, and at the state level to try and improve widows' rights in Anambra State. It looked at movements by Muslim women in India to try and improve women's rights and how they related to the women's movement more broadly. And it looked at the ways in which religious organisations had been engaged in the campaign to reform land law in favour of women, amongst other things, in Tanzania. And what the studies show is that there is religious opposition to some legal changes which the women's movement see as positive, and that religious opposition can effectively block change. So CEDAW, the domestication of CEDAW in Nigeria, was essentially blocked by the religious lobby in the end because of their opposition not to the principles of CEDAW, but to a very limited number of clauses within the International Convention. And you can guess what the clauses were related to. They were related to reproductive health. They were related to the idea of equality in marriage. However, if their support can be gained, they bring moral authority, they bring organisational capacity, and they bring the potential for mobilising grassroots support in favour of or to support a wider campaign for legal change. And the Anambra State example contrasted very much with this national level example in Nigeria, because in Anambra State, the campaign to try and improve the appalling way in which widows are treated by gaining progressive legal change at the state level gained the support of the Catholic Church, because women members of the Catholic Church themselves were suffering as a result of the way in which widows were treated. And they were able to mobilize grassroots support in favor of achieving, they did achieve, legal change at the state level. Now that's relatively recent, and the research didn't attempt to look systematically to what extent that had been implemented. And they were more interested in the campaigning strategy and tactics and the way in which religious organizations had been involved with that. But of course, views vary within and between the religions, and so we can't assume that religious leaders or people or organizations will either hinder or support movements for particular social changes. The question has to be with respect to which changes and in which circumstances. We can't make global statements like religion is a hindrance or religion is a positive support. Now, we looked at a number of other questions as well, which I'm not going to talk about the findings because of restrictions on time. We looked at some of the roles which faith communities and faith-based organizations have played in interreligious conflict and its aftermath in some urban areas. We looked at the scale and scope of faith-based organization activities in development, with some rather partial efforts at mapping those. It's very poorly documented. We looked at the development activities of faith-based organizations with a view to trying to assess in what ways they're distinctive, with some really very varied case studies in the different countries. We looked at one organization in particular and the role of diaspora links, religious links, through the diaspora, and what implications that had for the development activities in the area of origin. And we looked at some aspects of the relationships between faith-based service providers and the state. And unfortunately, I don't have time to go into all those findings. What I do want to do, and I guess in discussion with Catherine, one of the things that she asked me to do was to look at some of the issues that we faced in the research program. And I want to briefly mention 4 if I'm not running too much over time. You'll let me know, Catherine. The first question is the question of interdisciplinary research. We felt the need to draw in the expertise of different disciplines in order to tackle this multidimensional issue. But that raised a number of issues. First of all, it raised issues to do with the nature of knowledge and truth. Not only do different disciplines have different ideas about the nature of knowledge and the use of theory and the role of empirical analysis, but also the faith traditions have very different ideas about the nature of knowledge and the function of scholarship. So different positions on the spectrum between positivist approaches and interpretivist approaches within the social sciences imply different views about the role of theory in research within and between the disciplines. And those in turn have methodological implications. The one issue is the respective roles of empirical investigation and textual interpretation. Much of the writing on religious values and beliefs and the teaching that informs the teaching of religious organizations is normative rather than analytical. It draws on the interpretation of principles and to a much lesser extent on the study of lived religion. And it's often associated with a view that if more development activities were to be handled by organizations with a religious motivation or with institutional roots in a religion, then development objectives would be achieved more successfully. And but not all the work in that tradition is produced by theologians, by Islamic studies scholars. They're insider interpreters of a religious tradition. And there's a tendency, I think this is probably strongest in Islamic studies, for it to relate to ideal rather than actual lives and societies. Now that has a role, that has a very important role, clearly, but it sits uneasily with the social scientific research. And we had real difficulty bridging that divide and bringing theologians and Islamic scholars into the research program. And we ended up almost entirely using the social science disciplines. And I think that's a pity, but we experience real difficulties with these very different ideas about the nature of research between those, the insider scholarship and the stance of the social sciences. Those differences in ideas about the nature of knowledge are reflected, of course, in methodological differences. And in particular, the differences between positivist approaches, quantitative approaches, and qualitative approaches. And that links to a further issue, which is the question of subjectivity. The view that the study of lived religion implies that we should aim to represent as faithfully as possible the views of the research subjects. But the question of whether it's desirable or possible for a researcher to be objective about the social phenomena being studied still remains. It is an issue. The social sciences don't concern, ostensibly, they don't concern themselves with establishing, with even interrogating the truth claims of particular religions. But nevertheless, people bring with them, social scientists bring with them their own cultural and religious assumptions. And so having a supposedly objective, detached stance, given this ideological and emotional involvement of their own, makes an objective stance difficult to achieve. And that's the case even with positivist approaches, but it's even more difficult to handle when interpretivist approaches are adopted. And that links to this question of insider and outsider views. Now, some insiders within the religious traditions would say outsiders cannot understand. You're not a Muslim, you don't understand the way in which Muslims think. That, or you're not a Christian, you don't understand the way in which Christians think. But because we came from, many of the researchers, not all of them, came from a Western social science tradition, it more often was the other way around. Anthropologists, in contrast, would argue that their approaches and methods have been evolved precisely to enable them as outsiders to understand the nature and role of religion through developing an in-depth understanding of particular societies. But many social scientists don't have a sufficient level of literacy in religions which are not in their own cultural tradition in order to give them a good grounding on which to do social scientific research where other religions are part of the picture. A further issue that we experienced was the lack of a suitable conceptual framework for studying the relationships between development and religion. Because religion's been very neglected in mainstream development studies, and because developing countries have been very neglected in many of the social sciences which have been concerned with the study of religion, means that we really don't have a good conceptual framework. And one of the symptoms of that is that the different disciplines use a concept which has the same name in different ways to mean different things. They have different understandings of what apparently are common concepts. And so to draw on the insights of different disciplines, there has to be a great deal of preparatory work to develop the concepts with which to work, a common lexicon, if you like, let alone looking at what the expected relationships might be that can then be investigated between the different elements of religion and various aspects of society and of development. And so we decided as a research team that it would not be appropriate to try and construct a theoretical framework at the start, and instead to take a much more grounded theory approach to it, and we're still in the middle of doing that work. There are also a number of issues that are raised by doing international comparative research, and I'll just briefly mention three. One is the initial choice that has to be made between doing cross-sectional research and contextual research. The social sciences emerged out of a very specific Western and colonial intellectual history, and the relevance of that to understanding non-Western societies is often questioned. Multi-country comparative research that uses quantitative data, cross-sectional research, tends not to consider the history and the context of the countries that are under study, tends to analyse data for comparable dates without necessarily analysing whether that date is the most appropriate for analysing the phenomena under study, and not always analysing trends. So cross-sectional research does things like focus on particular indicators of religion, such as indicators of religiosity, sometimes just because they happen to be available, more than because they're particularly appropriate. And we were very sceptical of both the data and the approach of doing cross-sectional research. And so we decided in the programme to focus very much on contextual research in as great a depth as we could with the limited resources available. We argued that religion can only be understood within a particular context, and that led us to a preference for in-depth qualitative studies of particular organisations, particular contexts, and that gives rise to a difficulty then in international comparative research of not being able to hold enough of the variables constant to be able to make meaningful comparisons between countries. So then there are questions about what is the nature of the comparisons that you can make without them becoming banal. And I think that's still a challenge that we face. Another issue is the whole question of research, the existing research that's available, which is patchy and quite limited, and the data that's available, which again is patchy and very limited. There has come, some more data is become available during the lifetime of the programme, for example from the work being done by the World Values Survey or the Pew Research Forum. But we found that there was a constant refrain of the data isn't available, we don't have enough data to go on, it's poorly documented. And one of the outcomes of that is that it makes it very difficult to address identical research questions in different places because you're starting from different points in terms of the availability of existing knowledge and data. And so what we've got often is case studies that are not strictly comparable across different contexts, because to make them strictly comparable would not have made sense in a particular local context. A further issue is the whole question of academic traditions, which are very different in different contexts. They're influenced by the colonial history, which lead to different approaches to academic work, different methodological approaches, different epistemological approaches. And that's complicated by the very varying resource base of the research community in the countries under study. That influences the size and the quality of the pool of researchers available and their attitudes to research, which are influenced by their working context, by their salaries, whether they earn enough to live on or they have to go and do consultancy. What are the promotion criteria? All those sorts of practical things influence the attitudes of researchers to the nature of research, to carrying out research, and the resources they have available to do it, the academic tools they have available to do it, differ in different contexts. Also in the research programme, we faced a tension between the fact that we were able to do, even though it was government funding, we were able to do basic social science research, but there was an expectation that it would be policy relevant. And on the part of the funders and most other non-academic research users, they slip quite quickly into, but what difference does that make to what I do on Monday morning? In other words, they slip to what I would call operational knowledge. And that we have a constant and rather difficult debate about whether or not the things that we're coming up with are immediately applicable, whether the findings, you can see the immediate applicability of the findings. Very different views amongst the researchers about the desirability of doing that, but also posing issues for us in the way in which we use our findings. And there's a danger, I think, in researchers stepping too quickly into saying these are the implications of our findings. They mean that this is the way you ought to do something. And we've been very reluctant to do that, but we've been under considerable pressure to do it by some of the potential research users. So that poses an issue, I think, as well, that is a challenge for us. It arises partly out of the motives of the different people involved in the research, the motives of the commissioning body. Because it was a British government agency, that gave rise to considerable levels of suspicion about what were their motives. So we were constantly challenged in the countries about what is the motive of the British government in suddenly starting to research religion. And of course, this coincided with the whole war on terror agenda, which made it particularly difficult. So that layered in on top of all the colonial history, which Britain in particular has to deal with. The research subjects, such as religious organizations, also have varying motives for engaging or not with researchers, varying from fear about what the research might come up with and be used for, to the possibility that it might bring rewards. In other words, if you cooperate, well, maybe, who knows, you might get funding down the line. And I think we have to be very aware of researchers about how people do react to the research process. And the researchers themselves, of course, their motives vary for becoming involved. And in particular, influenced by their own stance, whether they are pro or anti-religion, to simplify. I've already mentioned briefly, so I won't spend time on this, that this question of the links between research and policy pose tensions and challenges for us. There is evidence there has been research on whether or not research influences policy, and if so, in what circumstances. And it shows very clearly that it is extremely rare to be able to link a particular research project with a particular policy change. It doesn't work like that. And yet many research funders sort of have an expectation that it's going to work like that. And you're constantly challenged to say, well, what's your evidence of influence? At least in the UK, that's a constant challenge. But it doesn't work like that. What tends to happen is that a body of research which challenges existing ways of thinking tends to build up over time. And there comes a window, a tipping point, at which all of a sudden thinking changes, but you can't attribute that changes in thinking to a particular research project. That just isn't the way it works. And so facing up to this challenge from the funders of demonstrate your influence, the influence of your findings, is difficult. And it's difficult to know in advance what they might influence. We, again, we're expected to say, well, which areas of policy do you think your findings might influence? What types of actors might your findings influence? And because there isn't this straightforward path of influence, it's extremely difficult to say that. It also raises questions about the choice of topics and the balance in a research program like ours between doing what I call basic social science research and operational research. And I'm very wary of going too quickly into research that clearly has operational implications, because if it's done too quickly, it may be based on an inadequate understanding of the context. I think in the long term, it's actually worth spending resources trying to understand the context better. And even if policymakers are involved in the process of talking about the research and thinking through the implications of the findings, it doesn't necessarily mean that they will actually take them on board when thinking about policy change. And finally, this question of research communication. Academics have traditionally not taken it particularly seriously. They've thought in terms of dissemination. They've thought in terms of, I will put my findings in the public domain, academics will take them up and discuss them, and that's fine and that's sufficient. I have no responsibility to do more than that. Now we have funders coming along saying, but you do have a responsibility. We would like the research we fund to reach other people as well, and we think that you need a much more directed strategy in order to do that, in order to ensure that other people are made aware of your research findings. Many academics are extremely reluctant to get involved in that. They don't see it as their job, and they certainly don't have the skills to do it. They don't always recognize they don't have the skills, but they almost invariably don't. But we have had to take that very seriously. And I think it's becoming a much more common refrain of the research funders in the UK these days. But the skills are in short supply. There aren't many people that really understand this process and how it works. And the skills are in short supply on both sides. On the side of the researchers in how to communicate, with whom, and skills of the potential users in terms of understanding what research can do and what it can't do. Now, the Religions and Development Research Programme has addressed some of the first-order issues in this subject area. We're wrestling still with conceptual development. We've done some mapping, we've problematized and tried to clarify some of the key concepts. We've undertaken some exploratory empirical research. We have shown, I think, that faith needs to be taken seriously as a social phenomenon in the context of development, and we've resisted taking normative positions on the role of religion, either positive or negative. But our focus on the social and political aspects of the relationships between development and religion, and our choice of those particular 4 countries to focus on, have imposed their own logic on the research and its outcomes, and have imposed their own logic and challenges on the comparisons, the international comparative dimension. And we're very conscious that an awful lot of work remains to be done. A lot of work remains to be done within the research programme in our remaining 4 months or so, but also beyond the research programme. We feel as though we've only scratched the surface. We've only tackled a small subset of the questions that ought to be addressed. We still have a lot of work to do in terms of synthesizing what our several projects show at the country level. Is there sum greater than the parts? We have more work to do in terms of the comparative analysis across the countries. We have to still review the balance in our work between taking religion as given and examining its relationships with and its implications for, its consequences for human development, and adopting an interpretive approach and saying we can't take religion as given. We've got to actually look at what it means in particular local contexts. We're still wrestling with that. We're very much looking at the implications of religion for development. It's the development agenda that is driving the questions. What happens if you turn that round and you say, well, what's happening to religion in this context? In the context of social, economic, political change, which goes under the sort of heading of development, then what are the implications of all that for what's happening within the religious traditions? And we're not really looking at that whole side of things. We have adopted a largely qualitative approach, and we had good reasons for doing that, and it's in many ways very valuable, but I don't for a moment think that it's enough. I think probably it's much to be gained by having a more combined approach, using elements of quantitative and elements of qualitative research, drawing on the strengths of both, and trying not to fall into too many of the pitfalls. I think there are a whole range of unaddressed research questions, But I think also I've talked for far too long, and I'm not going to go into those, but we could talk about some of the questions that we haven't addressed and that still desperately need research in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think you'll all agree that we've had a treat to hear a sort of overview of this very ambitious research program that has been going on for a number of years. Do you want to stand up, or?
No, I'll come and sit down.
What I suggest we do, as I had said at the beginning, is to go around very quickly just to introduce yourselves, and then we'll open it up for questions. So, do you want to start?
Robert Brandstetter. I don't know what.
You get 2 sentences.
I get 2 sentences. I just came back from southern Sudan, and where I was looking at advising USAID on operational knowledge about how to use the churches in the new independent state.
Fascinating. That's worth the subject in itself.
It is.
My name is Tanya Malik. I'm affiliated with UC Berkeley, and I'm interested in doing research, development research within conflict zones like Pakistan and Afghanistan, so with religious governments. So.
Stanley Cove, I'm a graduate of the Foreign Service School here, now a research fellow with the Cato Institute.
And I'm Rosemary Mulio-Keller, recent graduate, interested in international development.
My name is Walter Tiernan. I'm a freshman at American University, and I'm majoring in international relations with a focus on Latin America.
My name is Kelly. I'm also a recent grad student, and I'm from Brazil, but I'm very interested in the role of religion developed not only in Latin America, but in the Middle East.
I'm Emma Colson. I'm the Senior Military Fellow at the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, and I'm doing a research project on gender-based violence in Central Africa. I'm interested in roles of women, church, and religious community.
I'm Astrid Rieger, and I'm the program assistant at the World Faith Development Dialogue, which Catherine is the executive director of.
I'm Michael Bodakowski, also with the World Faith Development Dialogue, and I'm embarking on a research project to map the activities of faith-inspired actors working on development in South and Central Asia.
I'm Kalia Samra, and I'm also with the World Faith Development Dialogue.
Anna Federici with the World Faith Development Dialogue.
My name is Emily Roskowski. I just graduated from Catholic Theological Union in Chicago, and I wrote my thesis on religion and development, and I'm starting MSFS, Master of Science in Foreign Service program here at Georgetown this year.
I'm Karen White. I'm a grad student at Ohio State University in Arabic, and I'm interning at the State Department Office of International Religious Programs.
Thank you so much for speaking with us. I'm Andy Steele with the Center for the Study of the Presidency.
Kit Bigelow, until recently headed up a religious NGO here in Washington, D.C., focusing on human rights in the Middle East.
I'm Yidu. I come from Shanghai, China, and now I'm the Stoker Fellow in Berkeley Center. My research focused on the series of religion and globalization, and now I'm helping them develop the program on religion in China and the United States.
Hi, my name is Amy Jin, and I'm from the Center for Interfaith Action, and my research topic is looking at replicable models for FBOs and development.
My name is Tim Casey. I'm with the World Community for Christian Meditation, and I'm fall director at the John Main Center here at Georgetown for Meditation and Interreligious Dialogue, which is a student affairs program.
I'm Kim Hill. I'm a PhD student here in the government department, and my dissertation topic is the role of Pentecostal and charismatic movements in civil society in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. Right now.
My name is Julia Lau-Bertrand. I'm Kim's colleague. I do international relations. I'm looking at terrorism in Indonesia. And I'm originally from Singapore, and I used to be a civil servant, so I get the whole policy research tension.
My name is Jean Wilkowski, and I'm retired Foreign Service, very retired, as you can see. And I still keep in touch with thinking people in areas where I serve, particularly Africa, where they are doing some of this kind of research.
Dr. Louis Wright. I'm a rare book cataloger at Lollinger Library. I'm interested in Czech religious history and musical history. And I just returned from Tabor, Bohemia, where I gave a paper on Leo Janacek's opera about Mr. Wilczek's trip to the moon and back to the Hussite period in the 15th century.
My name is Jamie Scott, and I'm the program assistant here at the Working Center.
And I'm Abby Waldrop, and I'm the events coordinator at the Working Center.
She's made it possible for us all to be here. So we have a bit of time. I don't know how long you have or how long anyone else has, but let's count on maybe 20 minutes of an exchange. So who wants to start?
Sure. Can I also say that I've brought a few copies of some of the policy briefs, which are summaries of some of the finding. You're welcome to take them, and if anyone is leaving early, do feel free to come and get a copy if you'd like to on your way out. But they're all on our website, so they can be downloaded if we run out of copies. And as the new material starts to come out, the working papers and the summaries will also be put up on the website.
Do you have a guess of how many thousands of pages your book will have?
No, we have a contract for a book series, a series of edited books with Routledge, so the main academic output is going to be that. But in the interim, most of the research results get published as working papers.
It's quite an array.
Just out of curiosity, to study religion is kind of huge, especially when you're looking at both societal effects and individual effects. So my question is, particularly in dealing with individual effects, how do you account for the different theologies?
How do I account
for the different theologies, for the differences in the religions, and how that impacts development?
Differences between religion or differences within religions, because both are relevant.
Right. So let's start with between.
Yeah. Essentially, our starting point is to say that generalizations are not helpful. What's helpful is to look and see what's happening on the ground, and therefore to choose in an informed but ultimately quite arbitrary way a series of locations in which that can be investigated empirically. In other words, you can look and see what the content of the religious teaching is, what the teachers are saying, what the materials they're using are saying about a relatively limited set of issues. So not the whole theology, but about issues which we have selected because we think that they're particularly relevant to the development enterprise, if you like. Now, development, of course, is not a term used in any of the theologies. So you have to also say, well, you know, what is it? What are the terms that are being used? And what are the ideas that are almost always there in religious teachings? And there are ideas about the good life. There are ideas about how people should live their lives, and there are ideas about right social ordering. And in that context, there are ideas about what is well-being and what is poverty, about what is the right use of wealth, and how it, and that links then to ideas about inequality. There are lots of ideas about gender relations. And so what we did was then to say, well, within those broad things, there is a religious vocabulary to deal with, although it isn't developed as such, to say, to look at how people conceptualize those. And to ask them, if someone were to say to you, what do you think about development, what would you mean if you used that word? So to get their interpretation of what they would mean by how they would interpret that word. And then to look at one or two of the tools that are used in development to address the issues. So in the context of poverty and inequality, to look at things like access, things like credit, for example, as a tool which is used to address both poverty, primarily to address poverty, and to say, well, what did your religion teach you about the use of credit? Because that's a tool that's very popular in development. What does your religion teach you about women's access to education, girls' access to education? Because that clearly is one of the development tools that is used to try and address issues of gender inequality and women's disempowerment. So we had to try and operationalize it, and the way in which we did that was very much oriented to getting people to talk about their interpretation. Now that you could do at a community level, and some of the researchers did that, in which they were choosing particular geographical locations. And then you have to be very careful about how you handle the whole question about generalizability from that. In some places that itself is quite difficult because it's a very sensitive subject. Entry is quite difficult to get into ways of talking about it in certain circumstances. And so in some instances the researchers found that they had to do that through organizations rather than geographical locations. And so the way they did it was to gain entry through an organization and then to look at the way in which that organization, for example, Buddhist organizations in urban Maharashtra in India, and Hindu organizations. Because looking at geographical locations didn't seem to be a feasible way of doing it. Levels of distrust of researchers trying to do it were too high. And we have to reflect on the strengths and weaknesses of the approaches that we took.
Given the variance in belief and practice between religious leaders and practitioners on the local level, when speaking of fostering dialogue or religious-based change, is it more important to approach the leaders or the grassroots, have you found, in efficacy, basically?
I don't know that you can answer a question which is more useful, because that's an extreme way of posing the question, because my answer is always it depends. We didn't have a particular project which looked at religious leaders. We looked at, the one I've been talking about, looked at religious teachers at the very local level in particular organizations or particular localities. That's not the same as looking at religious leaders. And I think it would be very interesting to look much more explicitly at the nature of religious leadership and the views and the ways of operating in the political sphere and the social sphere of religious leaders. We have yet to see whether we might be able to pull together some material on that to say something useful about religious leaders and their role in society and in politics, and how they relate to other sorts of leaders, to political leaders, for example. So I'm not sure that I don't think I can answer your question. I'm not sure there is an answer.
If you're talking about development, you're talking about change, the acceptance of change. Any sort of change is going to change political relationships, social relationships within a society. And the people who are in control of the society will try to resist that change, won't they, by any means they can, because that would mean a diminution of their power. Okay. And it seems to me this is where religion can play a role. If you have a state-sponsored religion, which could use the religion in order to suppress the change, to resist the change, say this is not good because it violates the existing. Or I'm thinking back to the American Revolution. How is it justified? You know, we all have inalienable rights because of God. The laws of nature and of nature's God. And so this was a way of fostering change, but it wasn't a state-sponsored religion. The American founders were very careful about that. And I'm wondering if that is one of the distinctions that you can explore in terms of the acceptance of change, which is critical for development.
Yes, but I think it's actually more complicated than that, because you might say, for example, in Pakistan, we have a secular constitution, but nevertheless very close collaboration between religious interests, Islamic interests, and the government.
I'm not so sure I'd call it a secular constitution at this point, would you?
In theory, it's a secular constitution. There's
The
very
blasphemy laws?
strong elements, because I think there's very strong elements in it which are secular, despite the attempts to Islamize aspects of the law. I think there's lots of contradictions there, but I think also Islam is not homogeneous. And there's lots of contradictory currents within Islam, which underlie a lot of the sectarian conflict in Pakistan, and the conflict between the radical Islamic view, the mainstream Islamic view, and a large section of the population which regrets the erosion of what they see as a much more liberal view. And so you pose the question in quite a black and white way. Religion could be used as a way of, might be a block to change, or could be used as a way of facilitating change. I think it's just more complicated than that, because religion isn't a homogeneous entity anywhere. Even in a state which is 90-odd% Muslim, it's not.
When we try to answer why someone becomes a terrorist, or when we try to understand why a country is more developed than the other, and we try to see those elements in religion, how can you actually measure it? Because it's such a subjective element. I wonder how you dealt with that. I haven't read, but what do you do with that? Because I always think that the process of recruiting a terrorist in the Middle East or wherever, and the way the youngs are recruited for the narco traffic and the favelas in Rio, it's very much similar. But then one has a strong religious element, but the other don't. So how can you measure, like, oh, this is connected to religion and this is why it is like it is? And how?
I'm not sure that, I don't think you can measure in that sense. I would draw a distinction between measuring, which implies that it can somehow be counted, and assessing, which involves the researcher's interpretation of the empirical evidence. And I think that very much depends on your methodological orientation, your epistemological orientation. I think there are some questions that research can't answer, because ultimately they depend on judgment. And the researcher's judgment is one judgment, but other people may have different judgments. And I wonder whether the question that you've posed is not actually a question research can answer.
Yeah, because I couldn't do it.
So, okay.
You spoke of the Catholic Church, which supported the disadvantaged women in that local region, I think it's at state level. And obviously, in each faith institution, there will be a large gamut, and some will support, this is the nature of localized governances. But with your data, were there any cross-analyses to show, is there a degree of conformity or orthodoxy between different faith institutions, Catholic or Muslim and whatnot?
You mean conformity by their adherence?
So if there were 5 regions that were studied, were some more or less consistent with their support or non-support of these developmental programs? Is that something that could be assessed?
It could be assessed. We couldn't do it within the time and money constraints under which we were operating. That comes back to the earlier question about the variability between and within religions. There is no way, that sort of thing that you're talking about is very large scale, a very large scale research endeavour. And it was beyond the scope of our programme. I think I had hoped that the case studies in the different countries, and in some of the countries more than one region, would be directly comparable. And that comes back to the question I raised about the availability of existing work and data. And that was so patchy that what it made sense to do in particular local contexts varied, with the result that what we've got is case studies that are roughly comparable, but not rigorously comparable. And to do what you're asking, to tackle that question, I think you would have to impose a more uniform research design on your different locations, your different case studies, in order to be able to answer the research question. Now, it might well be legitimate, and I think there are some of ours where we've got interesting findings from one or two case studies. I think it would be a very nice thing to do, to be able to do it in the sense you're saying. You maybe look at 5 different contexts, and then maybe you can answer the question about in what circumstances does A happen, or does religion play B role. I think we've had to be much more exploratory than that because of the state of the field when we started.
I have 2 quick questions. One, how did you choose your case studies? As in, was it difficult to reach, the final list of 4 countries, and did you consciously pair up, sort of have 2 pairs in mind, in India and Pakistan, and then Nigeria and Tanzania? Second quick question is, given that whole thing about the tensions between operational knowledge and basic research, was there a conscious effort to include researchers who are also government servants or civil servants in the research team? Or as in, could there have been a way of including people with PhDs who happen to work for the British government or other governments in the team?
We had to, in terms of the choices, we had a whole series of choices, because the first choice was the 4 countries.
Sure.
And we had a balancing act there between what might make sense in research terms and what might appeal to the funder, because this is competitive bidding for research. You've all been there.
Sure.
What we looked for were, we had a number of criteria which were not applied in a particularly rigorous way. So the first criteria was that at least one of the major world religions was present in the country. And there either had been or appeared likely to be conflict which would be between the religions, which would be very developmentally destructive. And that, in addition, we needed countries in which they were interested, which the research funder was interested. So we looked for countries in which they had substantial aid programs. So that then led us to India, an East African example and a West African example, Nigeria and Tanzania. But another set of criteria came into play, was that the very common refrain amongst both the secular NGOs in Britain, like Oxfam, and the British aid programme, and I think other Western aid programmes, that they really don't know what they're doing in countries which are culturally and religiously unfamiliar to them. And so there was a constant refrain about, we really don't understand enough about the countries which are most unfamiliar. And in the context, that tends to be Muslim majority countries. It's not only Muslim majority countries, but that looms large. And so we then had to say, well, probably we ought to include a Muslim majority country because that's a particular issue with which they're concerned. And interesting, our choice was between Indonesia and Pakistan, and we had a short bidding period, and the Indonesians didn't get back to us in time. Our potential collaborating partners didn't get back to us in time, and we ended up with Pakistan. I mean, this is rigorous research choices.
Because Indonesia, I think, will give you very interesting results.
That's what we thought.
That's what phase 2 made.
But then within each country you then have a whole series of choices, because we've got the variation between regions in the country, and some of those are very big countries. You've got variations between the faith traditions, and you've got variations within the faith traditions, and all we've been able to do is just pick a few. And we could quite easily be challenged, I think, on how we've picked them. How we can deal with that is only by being very careful how we present our results. And I think that's the only way of dealing with it.
Great.
What was your second question?
The one about researchers from the government, if you have that. Or if that was an option.
I suppose in theory it would have been an option. What we had to go with was partners with whom we already had contacts, because we needed to identify partner institutions. And it is one of the things that we have criticised DIFD for, was expecting us to identify partner institutions from scratch in an exploratory programme, in a neglected area where there are no existing established research institutions. And it was a bit of a hit and miss process because we had to identify those partner institutions. And so we went for organisations which had the social science, range of social sciences that we thought we needed, that were also well networked in research terms, because we knew that they wouldn't have all the research capacity needed, and that also had links into the policy arenas, into the potential non-academic users of the research. So an organisation like the National Institute for Social and Economic Research in Nigeria, for example, is a mixture of a government think tank and an independent research institution. It gets some of its funds from government to do government's commissioned research, but it also has independent research funding to do other sorts of research. And we went down that road. And I think we would do that again. I don't think in this sort of exploratory basic social science research it would be appropriate. I don't think most civil servants could get their head round it.
True.
Actually.
Okay, let's take this as the last one.
Thank you. So when you're looking at India as opposed to Tanzania or Kenya, where the religions are all very different, you're looking at Christianity, you're looking at Islam, and you're looking at perhaps Hinduism and so forth, how do you factor in the different religions and the religiosity? I know you talked about that, and so when you're saying, okay, what is the role of religious organizations or religion in social movements or conflict management and so forth, how do you factor the different religions when you're comparing, say, in India to Tanzania, or where you're comparing the influence of Hinduism to the influence of Christianity or the influence of Islam, and so forth? And secondly, when you're also comparing the cases in which religious organizations have a positive influence on social movements and so forth, did you look at the factors in which made it enable the particular organizations or the particular institution to play such a positive factor as opposed to when it didn't in other similar areas? I think that for me is particularly interesting to see. Is there different factors that would influence that?
I think the answer is we struggled and we're still struggling, because, and it's of labelling this thing religion. I mean, even worse, labelling it faith. I think faith and faith-based organisation are concepts with which we struggle. I think they have a particular history and implications which make them very difficult to use, despite the prevalence of their use in America and Britain and so on. But even if you use the term religion, the interpretation of what that means is very different between the Abrahamic religions and the others, which are much more like philosophical traditions. And we've struggled with that. I think partly because we're coming from mainstream development studies and the development policy world. And if we can get the message across that the nature of the faith traditions is different, and therefore what you mean by this term religion is something rather different in the case of Hinduism to the case of Christianity to the case of Islam, I think we will have made a step forward. Because at the moment I think they think of it as much less varied than that, and they have very limited literacy in the faith traditions that they don't happen to come from. Most of them come from within the Christian faith tradition, even if they're not practicing Christians. And so that's how they think of religion. It's the way Christianity thinks of itself as a religion. And so, as I say, I think we're still struggling with that. And I think part of what we're doing is trying to tease out some of these concepts so that we can reduce the way in which they're used in an ill-informed and simplistic way, and to improve the way that they're used and the understanding on which their use is based. Now I think that's actually quite a difficult task, even though it doesn't sound very much. Your second question, which was about the circumstances in which religion engages positively, or religious organizations engage positively or not. Yes, we have tried to do that, but it's very much by unraveling particular sets of events or campaigns. And so I'd argue, have a look at the case studies, because I can't really summarize it quickly. It's in a teasing out process of trying to say, if you talk to different informants, you triangulate the stories that they tell you and try and use that to tease out what happened and why it happened in some ways in certain circumstances and different ways in other circumstances. And we've done it on the basis of a limited number of case studies, because that's all that we had the resources to do. And in some cases that means that we can't come to very definite conclusions. And it would be nice to have more case studies and be able to come to more definite conclusions.
Well, we could keep going, but I think that it's getting late and dinner is approaching. So thank you very much indeed to all of you, and thank you, Carole, for a very fascinating